Hi, everyone. I want to thank you for joining our webinar today. We are requesting that everyone put their name and organization in the chat so that we can see who's here in our community. I want to thank Christy Everett and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation for partnering with the Coastal Virginia Adaptation and Resilience Consortium, also known as COVA A&R, on these series of seminars this fall. I'm excited for our present presenters today because we get to hear how other Chesapeake Bay communities are incorporating green infrastructure in their resilience strategies. And we often hear that maintenance of green infrastructure is a concern in the Hampton Roads region. So I'm excited to include that we are including that topic here as well. If you haven't signed up for the Dutch Dialogue's 10-year Coastal Resilience Conference, which is going to be held at the Norfolk Waterside Marriott, please join us. It's November 5th through the 7th, and we are going to hear how local cities have incorporated coastal resilience work into their strategies, but we're also going to explore as a community, how do we move forward in the next 10 years? It's a real opportunity for us to work across sectors and come up with solutions that incorporate all aspects of our region. So I'll put that link in the chat, and I hope you'll join us there. And I'm going to turn this over to Christy, and thank you all for being here today.
Hi, thanks so much. Really do appreciate your participation in this program. We have a variety of participants, I think about 100 signed up. Carol herself is calling in from the West Coast, so really appreciate this kind of nationwide interest in this issue. These two speakers are fantastic, so really excited that you all will get to hear from them and learn more about this really important and relevant topic. I'm really thrilled with this series and the interest in the series. This is the second of three webinars that we're doing with COVA A&R, Coastal Virginia Adaptation and Resilience Coalition, as well as the Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Research at Old Dominion University. These are all about community-driven solutions for the region, and anything that we can do as together as a community and as organizations to advance sustainable solutions to both water quality, habitat, and flooding issues. We'll have more information about the next webinar at the end, but don't want to delay bringing you these fantastic speakers. We are recording this, so we can get out this recording at the end as well. And do put any questions that you have in the question and answer portion, not in the chat box, but the question and answer portion. And we'll get to those after we hear from our two speakers. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce David Wood. David is the Executive Director of the Chesapeake Stormwater Network, nonprofit organization devoted to promoting more sustainable, resilient, and equitable stormwater management across Chesapeake Bay watershed and beyond. David also serves as the technical coordinator for the EPA's Chesapeake Bay Program's Urban Stormwater Work Group, and he leads the evaluation of new stormwater practices and approaches to reduce nutrients and sediments in the Chesapeake Bay Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL. David is a certified climate change professional by the Association of Climate Change Officers and earned his Bachelor's of Arts in Biology from St. Mary's College of Maryland. So thanks so much, and David, look forward to hearing about your latest research and information.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Christy. Happy to be here. Let me get our slides pulled up and we can get ready to go. You guys see that okay? All right. Okay, so what I'm going to do today, we'll go ahead and dive right in. I'm going to walk through a couple different things. What I'm going to start with is just by talking about the nature of our changing conditions, the changing landscape, kind of setting the stage. What are the different changes that we're seeing, not just in climate, but also in kind of the physical landscape that we're dealing with in the stormwater sector, as well as kind of then tying that to the implications for stormwater management in the region. From there, we'll jump into, kind of what is the case for green infrastructure solutions, given those changes, how do they help to address some of those challenges? And then, I'll kind of close by, in part, teeing things up for Bill, talking about some of the emerging challenges that we do deal with as we implement green infrastructure, but also teasing a couple of upcoming resources that we're going to be rolling out, the Chesapeake Stormwater Network and some partners over the next 2 years or so. All right, so let's go ahead and start by talking about the changing landscape, how things are changing here in Virginia, as well as across the broader Chesapeake Bay watershed. And like I said, I'm not going to just talk about climate, but also development and the simple passing of time as its own change to the landscape. So let's start though with climate, since that's where most of our brains go, I think, when we're talking about changing conditions, adaptation, and resilience. With climate, the easiest place to start, I think, is with temperature, since a lot of the other changes then flow from there. The Chesapeake Bay program conducted its climate assessment several times, actually, several iterations of it. This data comes from 2021. They used an ensemble of 31 different global climate model projections to help us understand a range of outcomes under different timelines and under different future emission scenarios. For all these projections, there is always a range of potential outcomes, right? And when we're making planning decisions, we want to look at these different scenarios and decide what we want to use based on our risk tolerance, the level of service that we want to provide, and the ability for us to effectively communicate the reasoning behind our decisions. So I'm mostly going to use median values here, the 50th percentile. Use a time period that's usually centered around about 2050. There's a couple instances where I'll use a later century projection around 2075. And then I'm going to use mostly a moderate emissions scenario. I'm not going to get into all the details of that, but an RCP 4.5. So for temperature, the median projection for 2055 is a 2.05 degree Celsius increase in temperature compared to 1995, which is the baseline that we use. In Fahrenheit, that's a 3.7 degree increase. Now that's Chesapeake Bay watershed wide average. Obviously, there's going to be some minor fluctuations depending on where you are. Tying that into water, specifically precipitation first, you might have heard that warming climates are fueling larger storm events, right? Like some of the major hurricanes that we've seen over the past couple of years, the large flooding events in Texas and Nashville, North Carolina, as well as, locally. Part of the reason for that is that warmer temperatures result in more cloud capacity for moisture. There's increased evaporation and humidity, and then those clouds can hold on to that moisture, and the rain falls in greater volumes over fewer rainfall events. So while total average annual precipitation in the DC metro region from 2002 to 2021 is only about 5 to 15% higher relative to the beginning of the century, 1900 to 1960, there's been a 60% increase in the total precipitation falling in the heaviest 1% of days. So basically, these changing conditions are making when it rains, it pours very literal, very tangible, right? So another way to look at the changing precipitation conditions are by looking at rainfall intensity. This table is adapted from data from the projected intensity duration frequency curve, or IDF curve data tool for the Chesapeake Bay watershed and Virginia. That tool was developed by NOAA's Mid-Atlantic RISA team a few years ago. Here I'm showing for several cities or counties across Virginia what the 2-year, the 10-year, and the 100-year 24-hour storm event look like compared to kind of the current standard for precipitation data, which is Atlas 14. These are also based on median projections. These use 2075, but again, they use that moderate emissions scenario of RCP 4.5. So you can see, kind of the range of increases kind of depending on the design storm and where you're located in the watershed. There might be kind of an increase projected over the next 50 years or so of 10 to almost 30% compared to what we would expect from Atlas 14. And I'll just mention too that again, this is using a pretty moderate scenario. The Roanoke city change factor can go as high as a 70% change factor if you use the 90th percentile result for the higher emissions scenario. So a large range of outcomes, but generally centered around kind of a 20% increase. Just so you know where that comes from, this is a screenshot of that tool. You can access this. This is open source. You can see visually how the patterns vary somewhat geographically across the state, with the greater increases in rainfall intensity projected mostly to occur kind of in the south central, southwest part of the state. But you can also see that selection panel on the left-hand side. So if you want to play around with different time periods, emission scenarios, and return intervals, you can do that and see all the data presented in different ways. The last way I'll show these changing conditions relative to precipitation is using, actual data. For those who prefer to look at actual events to lend support to what we're seeing in these projections, these are data from a watershed in Western Pennsylvania, Negley Run outside of Pittsburgh. It compares rainfall events at different sizes based on what the historical analysis would have predicted. In other words, Atlas 14 values, which are in green. What actually occurred are in these blue bars for this period from 2003 to 2018. So you can see how much the historical, data, the Atlas 14 values underestimate what was actually occurring across the full range of storm events. This leads to obviously real world consequences in terms of flooding and water quality protection. The other component, for our coastal folks of the water and projections and changing conditions or sea level rise. This is also from the Chesapeake Bay Program's climate assessment. By 2055, we're looking at a projected 1.7 feet or 53 centimeters of sea level rise for the Chesapeake Bay watershed. There are a lot of implications of that, obviously, from human health and safety perspectives. But also, I think it's worth noting, as part of this assessment, the Bay program looked at projected tidal wetland acreages in the Bay under these changing conditions by it's a model called SLAM, the Sea Level Affecting Marsh Model. Using 1996 again as a baseline scenario, they modeled losses by as much as 34% in 2055 with that amount of sea level rise. So significant marsh loss. That's a decrease of 110,000 acres across the Bay watershed by 2055. All right, those are the changing climate conditions, but of course our physical landscape is changing as well. Development continues at a rapid pace across the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Virginia's population increased by over 700,000 people between 2010 and 2024. And of course, with more people comes a need for more places for them to live, to eat, to learn, to walk, to park, to drive, all of those different things, right? So the Chesapeake Bay program's land use land cover data, which is run every 5 years or so, shows over 42,000 new acres of impervious cover in Virginia added between 2014 and 2021. While Virginia is one of the fastest growing states in the watershed, this trend is seen across the entire region. Over 115,000 acres of new impervious cover added across the whole Chesapeake Bay watershed in the same time period. And then finally, I don't think a lot of us think of time passing as a changing landscape, but Father Time does come for us all, as anyone who's been following Bill Belichick's path over the last few years can attest. Sometimes just sticking around longer than you should can have some really negative consequences for the operation of our systems. The aging of our infrastructure is in many ways its own changing condition, right, that we have to be prepared to grapple with. As our stormwater infrastructure continues to age, we experience myriad new problems, from pipes that corrode or break or clog, to infrastructure that just hasn't kept up with these changing climate conditions, right? Much of our infrastructure was designed using precipitation data from the 1940s, and it's struggling to effectively convey the modern 10-year storm event. So definitely something that we have to think about in terms of our changing conditions landscape. So let's tie that in to the implications for stormwater managers. The subheader here for stormwater management, our runoff is going to be hotter, wetter, dirtier, and stronger. If you choose, you can sing that to the tune of Daft Punk song for those who know it. But we'll stick to the basics here, right? So we're going to start, again, going back to temperature with thermal impacts. When the air temperature warms, of course, it heats the impervious surfaces in our communities, which radiates that heat back, transfers a lot of that thermal energy to any runoff that comes in contact with those surfaces. Recently, there's been a lot of work looking at thermal impacts on the Chesapeake Bay health. These two images come from a recent Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee workshop on rising temperatures. The image on the left are trends in stream water temperature between 1960 and 2014. The red dots are warming, blue dots are cooling, and the bigger the dot, the larger the magnitude. So you can see obviously a lot more red dots, a lot more large red dots, certainly than blue dots. Particularly in Virginia, I think there's only one blue dot on the map there. The results are impacts on aquatic biology. Those impacts might be shifting some of our management emphasis, more into the tributaries as well. Then the right image here shows how the warming extreme temperatures then combine with things like atmospheric forcings, warmer ocean boundaries to ultimately increase main stem water temperatures as well. I should also note here that these temperature changes are being felt more acutely by communities that have experienced decades of underinvestment, neighborhoods that have far fewer green spaces and less tree canopy. Data from the Fifth National Climate Assessment showed that these historically under-resourced neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods, can be as much as 12 degrees Fahrenheit hotter during a heat wave than nearby wealthier neighborhoods in the same city, right? So these directly, influence our decisions that we make as watershed planners, as stormwater managers about green space and green infrastructure investments as we try to maximize our impact with the decisions that we're making. Moving on to runoff impacts from these changes, we know that much of our existing infrastructure is, like I said, undersized for future conditions. The pipes and detention basins were mostly designed using precipitation data from a resource called TP40 that came from NOAA, was published back in 1961. Anything built between 1961 and 2006 used data that came from the first half of the 1900s. And so we know, based on the graph I just showed you from Negley Run in Pittsburgh, that using historic data isn't representative of future conditions. And so we need to think about designs that account for future rainfall that's going to be more intense, possibly shorter in duration. The implications are thinking about sizing, how it affects our inlet design, how we plan for maintenance, and then where we need to focus our investment to address the most acute capacity issues in our systems. As we talk about changing conditions too, the other way to kind of look at this, is with what we call our hydrograph, right? And a lot of you are probably familiar with this. More impervious surfaces in our watersheds and in our communities leads to more of the rain that falls being converted into runoff. And so you have more runoff volume and more runoff velocity that you have to handle. And then you add in additional rainfall to the mix with these different, climate conditions, and you amplify that effect. So in the pre-development case, when you have less impervious surface, you have less rainfall, you're seeing kind of the solid line on the graph where you get a relatively gradual peak as a storm event arrives in terms of what you're seeing kind of in the stream. And then, it also gradually recedes. Once we get more impervious cover, and we get more intense rainfall, we get these more dramatic peaks. They are earlier, they rise quickly, and they recede quickly. Green infrastructure practices are designed to help us move closer back to the pre-development hydrologic conditions, that solid line conditions that we're a little bit more comfortable with. And then finally, just to touch on the dirtier water problem, more intense rainfall is more likely to dislodge and mobilize sediment and any contaminants that might be bound to it. We see lots of fine-grained sediments in particular being carried in suspension. They get deposited in inconvenient places in our landscape. The top middle photo here is several inches of sediment accumulated in a detention basin. The photo on the bottom is several inches of sediment covering walkways in a park in DC. Taken together, the impacts of changing condition is likely to make water quality improvements more difficult. These graphs on the right come from the Chesapeake Bay program's midpoint assessment, which was in 2017. So they aren't the latest and greatest, but as they continue to run new models, through their tools and refine their estimates, the general magnitude of these changes is held pretty steady. The combination of increasing temperature, precipitation, and sea level rise has kind of moved the goalposts of attainment of nutrient reduction goals. The change for 2025, when we were looking at it in 2017, was an additional 3 to 5%, reduction required for nitrogen and phosphorus. Moving forward, we expect that level of effort to continue to increase, as we go. So we're not only having to offset kind of growth of the urban sector, the developed sector with more impervious surfaces, but also kind of the increased level of effort due to these changing conditions. All right, so now let's make the case for green infrastructure in terms of the capacity it can provide, redundancies in our systems, and kind of the multiple benefits that we can offer through these systems. So starting with kind of the most maybe obvious or the most direct, which is green infrastructure and flooding. Basically, whether it's at the site, block, or sub-catchment level, targeted green infrastructure can help to reduce localized flooding. This in turn reduces related impacts to things like basement backups, nuisance flooding, when stormwater inundates backyards, streets, and other public areas, right? When you distribute green infrastructure practices throughout a watershed or throughout a catchment, you can reduce total runoff and peak flows, which helps to mitigate downstream riverine flooding and associated damages as well. This is done, of course, by intercepting rainfall. You create opportunities to capture and infiltrate water. The figure here shows the decrease in peak flows, which was 5 to almost 30%, decrease in runoff depth of 20 to 50%, and decrease in total flow volumes of 25 to 45% that were modeled across a range of different storm events for a watershed in New Hampshire where green infrastructure practices, effectively reduce the impervious cover by about 20%. So you can also think about green infrastructure as sort of helping out your aging gray infrastructure, right? We talked about how aging conditions, are in of themselves a changing condition, right? So oftentimes, your pipe network, like we said, is already undersized. It might have breaks or clogs. You're finding that it's not even handling your 10-year storm event anymore. Adding green infrastructure kind of within that catchment or upstream can help reduce the flows that are going to be heading to those flood-prone sections of your pipe network and can maybe provide some relief before you are going in and digging up that whole system, which can be obviously very costly, very expensive. Green infrastructure strategies that include things like bioretention as well as tree-based practices also can reduce thermal impacts on stormwater by reducing those heat island effects and cooling those impervious surfaces that are otherwise warming up. A recent study modeled the impacts of green infrastructure on downstream heat loads affecting trout in Straubel's Creek watershed, which is near Blacksburg in Virginia. The authors there found that the combined practices reduced the total heat load by 62%, and the percentage of the time that the creek was heated above toxic levels decreased by 12% over the course of the summer. Further, the heat loads from storm events were nearly eliminated altogether. It's also worth noting here in terms of green infrastructure and temperature that, while it's not necessarily stormwater specific with regard to temperature, implementing green infrastructure practices can also help mitigate some of the heat-related maintenance and life cycle costs for critical infrastructure. So, for example, tree shade on asphalt reduces the impacts of heat and thus, the need to repave as frequently. A study in California of shaded and unshaded streets where large trees provided at least 20% shade on the streets found that they saved $1 per square foot in reduced repaving costs by 58% over a 30-year life cycle. So some financial benefits to those impacts as well. Then I think water quality benefits of green infrastructure are the one we're probably most familiar with and understand, but in the context of changing conditions, it's worth noting that because the changing conditions move our goalposts, increased rates of implementation are almost certainly necessary, even to just kind of hold the line on pollutant reduction. Green infrastructure also creates redundancies in our systems. Large detention systems are effective for reducing peak flows, but combining them with green infrastructure helps prevent those systems from being overburdened, provides opportunity for capture and treatment kind of throughout the watershed. Finally, while we're dealing with greater intensity storms, there's a fair amount of evidence that the 1-year storms, the 90th percentile storms, kind of those more frequent events that we're usually trying to use for water quality treatment, they're not being impacted as much. I mentioned how much of the burden of the additional rainfall volume is being added, to those large infrequent events. So our water quality practices are still expected to be effective for those smaller events. So I just want to close with like 3 quick slides talking about some emerging challenges and upcoming resources to kind of tie things together and lead us into Bill's talk as well. So I'm just going to quickly mention maintenance since Bill's going to talk about that much more. While it shouldn't deter you from green infrastructure, it is important to consider maintenance at all stages of the project. They're designed for water quality, as I just mentioned, so we have to be aware of how large events might impact them, bypassing treatment or high velocities leading to, erosion or clogged filter media, distressed vegetation, just things we need to keep in mind in our design phase. Using rapid visual indicators, ways to kind of go out and quickly check, that your investments are okay without having to do a deep investigation, can help move things along and get you through your inspections more quickly. When I talk about increased bypass of flow, what I mean is more flow being concentrated on fewer events. More of that flow is likely to move through our BMPs without having time to infiltrate. Or in some cases, they might avoid entering the practice altogether. A study in New York in 2016 found, 23 to 40% of bypass for a lot of bioretentions during, extreme events. The non-extreme event bypass often happens because of maintenance conditions like the one on the right. But a lot of times it's, a poorly designed or undersized inlet. So again, things that we have to think about in our design. We're also thinking about how we make our green infrastructure more resilient by designing them in ways that are adaptable, like using things like continuous monitoring and adaptive control technologies or smart BMPs. That's the photo all the way on the right there. Or we can squeeze more performance within the same footprint by doing things like adding, soil media with reactive amendments or biochar that can help increase storage volume. We can do things with our under drains to create more internal water storage or improve our vegetative practices as well. And so this is it. Last slide. I just want to mention a couple of tools that are on the horizon as we continue to talk about these changing conditions. These are all coming from a project that the Chesapeake Stormwater Network is working on with a great team from RAND, Carnegie Mellon, Cornell, and the Watershed Institute. The first is a practical guide to vulnerability assessments for stormwater agencies, different approaches to conducting vulnerability assessments, determining, what the right fit is for your resources and your needs. The second tool is a way to basically interpret and use those climate projections more effectively for planning and design decisions. How do you decide which emission scenario you want to use or which time frame you want to use? And then the last is a series of resilient stormwater design guidelines. So what are what is a menu of options that we can, take with our approach to designing green infrastructure practices that will make them more adaptable or more resilient to these changing conditions and changing landscapes. So those are all coming kind of between this winter and the end of next year. So a lot to run through. Hopefully I didn't run too far over time. There's my email if anybody has questions, but look forward to both Bill's conversation as well as the discussion.
Thank you, David. You provided a lot of information, but I think you did it in a way which hopefully won't be so overwhelming. So kudos to you for getting all those key topics in there and again, weaving in a very changing landscape, literally and figuratively. Please do ask questions in the Q&A portion of this, audience members, and we will be sharing these slides and a recording afterwards. But you've got some real experts, as you can tell here. So please go ahead and get those questions in the question and answer box, and we'll get to those at the end. Another expert coming up who's very got a lot of knowledge on the ground. So really looking forward to hearing Bill as well. Now, Bill Cesanek, Senior Practice Leader for Environmental Planning at CDM Smith, with over 35 years of experience fostering interdisciplinary approaches to water resource planning. Since 2014, Bill has also served as a co-chair of the Water and Planning Network Division of the American Planning Association. Bill is an adjunct professor at the Rutgers Graduate School of Planning and Policy since 2012. Bill is a primary author of APA Planning Advisory Service Report, Planners and Water. So without further ado, I'll let Bill share his slides and the program.
All right. Am I sharing? No. Share, okay. Can you see my slides? We're good. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Christy, for that great introduction, and thank you, David, for that somewhat unnerving review of our current status with respect to stormwater. You made a very persuasive case for the value of green infrastructure management and better controlling stormwater. I think that we're in a situation where we have a perfect storm. We have deteriorating infrastructure. We have significant growth in the watershed and increase in impervious cover. We also have used sort of a somewhat outdated engineering paradigm of rapid conveyance, where we take rainfall accumulation and rapidly convey it elsewhere rather than trying to manage it locally. And then on top of all this, we have climate change, which is changing the intensity and damage of storms. So in that regard, I would like to say that, maintenance has often been used as a concern about why not to implement green infrastructure. I want to talk about that a little bit today. It should not be a showstopper. David made the value proposition for green stormwater infrastructure. I don't need to go over that here, but it's important for water quality management, attenuation of flooding, environmental management, protecting public health and welfare, and there are many, many benefits. GSI and GSI maintenance. We know that it's green infrastructure is critically important in managing stormwater, increasingly so, given the four factors I cited before in the perfect storm. But we also know that assumptions about the difficulty and cost of GSI are often used to justify avoidance of green. And this is a little troublesome, but it's not surprising. All systems require maintenance, and by planning and designing with maintenance in mind, you can manage those costs. Um, Two major concerns basically come up with respect to maintenance. One is lack of expertise and experience in maintaining GSI. And this is something we found to be especially true in public works situations, or for private landowners. They really don't have a lot of familiarity in dealing with living systems. The second is a misunderstanding of the methods and costs to maintain green stormwater infrastructure. So, regarding item one, there's extensive information and guidance that has been published on GSI design, operation, and maintenance. And I'll run through a few examples of that in a few minutes. And there are studies conducted by EPA, University of New Hampshire, Cornell, others that have concluded that GSI and GSI maintenance is more often than not less expensive than gray. So it shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. But it is different. And that's what folks have often not recognized. This quote from Sustainability Directory at the bottom is great. The fundamental challenge of green infrastructure maintenance lies in understanding its ecological nature and adapting traditional infrastructure management approaches to suit living systems. And that is really the change we're talking about. Perceptions about GSI maintenance can impede broader GSI implementation. So there are misconceptions about cost, and there's uncertainty about the long-term cost. And we'll talk about that in a second. GSI maintenance is more complicated and labor intensive than traditional gray. In green systems, we're talking about plants, soil, and we're talking about living systems that need different kinds of maintenance, not necessarily more or less than gray infrastructure. And there has been unfamiliarity with specific maintenance requirements. And there's been a learning curve actually in the evolution of green infrastructure. In the beginning, when green infrastructure was being implemented, it was sort of a creative opportunity for landscape architects to put every kind of plant, flower that they could think of and make these sites as attractive as possible. And what we quickly learned was that that would be a nightmare for maintenance later. And now the shift is to more monotypic grasses that have better performance. In terms of data for maintenance requirements and success, that is evolving. And this is certainly a learning curve that we're on with respect to green infrastructure, but we have enough under our belt to build and operate and maintain these systems effectively. Sometimes folks are afraid of fragmentation in maintenance responsibilities across different government agencies. Is it the Parks Department? Is it the Public Works Department? Is it the Streets Department? You know, who does what? And sometimes you need to build a coalition within your local government to manage green systems. There's also difficulty oftentimes in identifying when there is a need for maintenance and repair. How much sediment has accumulated? Is the outlet blocked? Is the inlet blocked? What do we need to do in terms of plant replacement? Is that a weed or is that a plant? These questions come up all the time, and there's guidance for all of this. And last but not least, there's typically a lack of dedicated funding. And we found that stormwater utilities can be very effective in addressing that, but there are also other ways to work with the community to build coalitions for maintenance. So planning with maintenance in mind is key. You want to assess your soils, conduct infiltration testing. You want to look at land uses, surrounding land uses, and prior land uses. In some cities, we found that green infrastructure was being recommended on top of old industrial sites where there was known pollution. So that those tend to be constraining activities. You want to be respectful of the drainage and the topography, and that's really a big change. In the past, We've piped stormwater from where we don't want it to where we do want it. Now we want to recognize the topography more and work with that. We want to identify GSI planning support staff, and that's critical as well. Again, building that coalition among municipal departments or county departments or regional groups is critical. And performing opportunity analysis is really helpful. Sometimes you can have the planning department work with engineering group and look at areas that might be suitable for green infrastructure installation. There's also design with maintenance in mind. Avoid future maintenance issues by smart design. Install hardscapes instead of planted areas if trash is an issue. There are many good examples of hardscapes, of pervious pavement, of pavers that are highly pervious and are very effective. But we also want to take advantage of natural environment, trees and grasses. Install grasses instead of planting and we find that the landscape architecture design palette has really been a little too creative in the past, and we're trying to and being successful in bringing that back to more effective plantings. Provide ready access. This is often not thought of, but we need manholes, we need bobcat mower access, we need access to forebays that are trapping sediment, and be thoughtful about overflow bypass. This is critical. What we've seen is that some cities want to design overflow valves into every single green infrastructure instance. And that's very costly. And often it's turned off and only used in case of a local flooding. New York City, for example, said, that's fine. Let it overflow. It'll run down to the next catchment and be trapped there and be drained there. We don't need to add to the cost of each individual stormwater installation. So, some considerations for maintenance. Most of the utilities that I've worked with, public work departments, are highly reactive. There's not a budget for green infrastructure or green infrastructure maintenance. And there's a need to shift to more proactive approaches. It lets you manage your costs better, and it also increases the reliability of your stormwater systems. And how do we do that? We do that now increasingly through asset management software, where we can record our physical infrastructure digitally, we can come up with work schedules, and we can identify tools and crew assignments for managing green infrastructure the same way we manage water and sewer pipe and systems. Construction inspection. This is critical. We've seen in many cities that poor precision on installation of green infrastructure facilities, such as street inlets, has led to need for repair down the street, down the line. And what we see is that when we're trying to capture an inch or an inch and a half of rainfall, that if the inlet is a half an inch too high, we've cut out 50% or more of the effectiveness of that inlet that goes to green infrastructure facility just by poor installation. So tighter precision on construction inspection is really important. Having maintenance agreements are good. Complete streets component. Again, more and more cities in their transportation planning have been developing complete streets plans, and it's really useful to embed green infrastructure in that. Also, develop partners in maintaining your GSI. As I said, both community and other regional groups, maybe adjacent municipalities where you share equipment. There are lots of opportunities for partnership. And last and not least is workforce training. We found that many staff who have been used to dealing with traditional public works infrastructure, water, sewer, and stormwater, don't really have skills for living systems. And there are a number of great programs out there, and I'll show you a few of them in a minute. So, are we lacking reliable and effective information about GSI maintenance? And the answer is a resounding no. And I'm just going to run through a few examples here of what's out there in terms of web availability. And this is just a small sampling of what's out there. We have EPA's information. We have operation and maintenance guidance. They talk about weeding. They talk about removing accumulated sediment. They talk about repairing areas with erosion. Again, I've provided links here, and if you download this later, you'll be able to check out these links and dive into the maintenance activities further. Philadelphia has a SMP maintenance guide documents, and you can see chapter 6 is about post-construction operation and maintenance guidance. And this is an example of that. They talk about remulching void areas, treat diseased trees, how to recognize those, keep overflows free and clear. So there is, again, good information available. We have in New Jersey, where I'm located, we have the Rebuild by Design projects, and we built this a web page for the Department of Environmental Protection in New Jersey to help folks manage local stormwater infrastructure. We have the stormwater toolkit. A lot of folks said, well, we don't have any templates or guides. We don't have anything to give to our maintenance crews when they're going out of the field. So we developed some example maintenance cards that they could be given. And when they go in the field, what to look for at a particular installation. There's the Sustainability Directory, which is a great website, and they've broken down maintenance into the fundamentals, intermediate issues, and academic issues. And these talk about the range of activities from building consensus to finding funding to understanding how the systems work better. But they focus on, at one point, vegetation management, soil health, and water management, which are the keys. And a lot of public works staff are not, educated or have no experience on vegetation management or soil health. So this is a great reference. Brandywine Conservancy, again, they have a guide to green stormwater infrastructure. They have stormwater planner. They have operation and maintenance recommendations. We've also found that bioswales have become unpopular in some locations. So they need regular maintenance, and some locations are actually avoiding installation of bioswales. This is what happens if you don't maintain your bioswales or your street planters. They accumulate trash and debris. But in some locations, you might not want to install them if trash is an issue or maintenance is a challenge. In other areas, you might want to increase your maintenance of these facilities. And again, to mention that complete streets planning can include green stormwater infrastructure, and many of the guides, Denver as an example, have complete and green streets components. So now let's talk about cost a little bit. This is always a challenge. ASCE has issued this report. That's a couple years old, but it provides a wide range of maintenance costs. And this is because the utilities capture these costs in different ways. They report them differently. As I indicated before, some utilities are taking repair costs of poor installation and lumping them into the maintenance budget. Other situations, poor installations have occurred, impervious pavement that needs to be replaced. Does that go under maintenance or not? That's a good question. So we really need to be more careful about how we assign maintenance costs and how we tally those up. What we found is that if you're careful about tallying up those costs and assign them more properly, you fall into a certain range, and you can see that in this graph of 4,000 to 6,000 per impervious acre maintained. But we also find that if you design the facilities properly, if you use living systems, and if there's attribution of installation errors, then we get a muddle of maintenance costs, and they're not that reliable. So the jury's really still out, and a lot of systems are reluctant to report their maintenance costs because they're not sure that they're accounting for them properly. Perhaps last but not least, there are some great training programs out there. NGICP at the bottom, National Green Infrastructure Certification Program. There are others, Denver, many other cities run. I know that the Sustainable Business Network in Philadelphia runs training for contractors actually to maintain these facilities. Um, so I just wanted to acknowledge all the many green infrastructure operations and websites out there that helped me put this together. And I'm happy to answer questions now. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill. I think we'll get David back up as well on screen. And we've got a few questions. If people are feeling shy, you can ask that question anonymously as an anonymous attendee. So if that's stopping you from answering questions, that's a route you can take, and go ahead and put that in the Q&A box. We've got a few questions in there now, and I've got one or two as well. Someone asked, I think this could be either, I don't know if we know the answer to this, but it's probably a good question these days. In case the EPA guidance, Bill, that you mentioned becomes inaccessible, is that the same resource page copied is it same resource copied anywhere else for continued accessibility, just a redundant?
Interesting. There have been a lot of changes in availability of federal data, so I don't know that I can answer that question perfectly. There is a lot of data out there among universities, among nonprofits. So much of the EPA data is repeated elsewhere. So if you strike out at EPA, there's no reason to stop your search. There is tons of data out there.
Great, and I'll just, I think, elaborate as well as, are there central clearinghouses, or is it just really kind of a working your way through the web and finding different resources?
University of New Hampshire, Cornell, the city of Philadelphia was really the first green infrastructure program that was authorized by EPA to deal with combined sewer overflows. They have an incredible library of materials available, and I've been working with them for many years. And there are other materials, such as, groups in Virginia, throughout the country. There is significant information available.
David, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I'm going to drop a couple other links in the chat for folks if they're interested. Obviously, shameless plug, like Chesapeake Stormwater Network has a ton of resources available on
You deserve a
inspection and
shameless
maintenance
plug. Incredible
and
resources,
trainings
yeah.
and things like that if folks are interested. But there's some other resources too. There's a recently launched Green Stormwater Infrastructure Impact Hub that the Nature Conservancy worked on with the Green Infrastructure Leadership Exchange. That's a great resource as well. Some good guides in there as well that just came out like a couple months ago.
Yeah, and David, I know you're trying to add resources in the chat, and we can also send them out as well if that's easier. But to Chesapeake Stormwater Network, do you want to just elaborate a little bit on what you do in those services? I know not only do you have an ongoing webinar series, I believe currently, but the Bubba Awards is a great plug as well. And then just all of those webinars that have been archived, they're all accessible. I've watched a bunch of them. They're really incredible. So I don't know if you just want to elaborate on those as well.
Yeah, thanks. So we at CSN offer a lot of different training and resources. Through our work at the Chesapeake Bay program, like we were involved in a lot of the expert panel reports that have all the definitions and details around different, practices that provide nutrient and sediment reduction credit that's, eligible under the Chesapeake Bay requirements. But we also have like 100 webinars that are recorded and available on our website. We have a training program for students and early career professionals called CUSP, Chesapeake Urban Stormwater Professionals, where you can get CEUs, if you're interested in that as well. It's sort of we're actually closing up on our fall cohort right now for that, but we'll be offering it again next year. And all of those programs, including like the Bubbas, which is a case studies and kind of celebratory type of program, it's all free, thanks to funders that we have with EPA and National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So if folks are interested in any of that, you can reach out I put the link to our website in the chat. We are currently, like, we just hired a contractor to redo our website. So if there's anything that you're having trouble finding, you can always email me and I can direct you to it. But there will be a cleaner version of that hopefully by the beginning of next year.
That's really helpful. And I will just echo incredible resources there. So encourage people to follow up on that. There was also a question, somebody mentioned maintenance is critical, but monitoring is as well to assess the effectiveness over time and also inform adaptive management. Is there a way to integrate these two aspects in a single coordinated approach that you all can envision or that you've seen work?
Maintenance and monitoring really go hand in hand. If you have a regular program for GSI maintenance, it involves visitation to check the condition. You can also do monitoring during those events. There has been some attempt to build some remote sensing devices. I know at the various universities that will talk about whether a GSI installation is dry or there are other issues in terms of water quality and high sediment levels. But those are fairly new, but they're interesting in terms of having a little basically soil moisture meter read out via internet or Bluetooth to local residents, Wi-Fi, and inform them that the planter out front needs some watering. And people are often willing to do that as you build consensus. So monitoring the performance is critical because that declines in performance through monitoring indicate need for maintenance. And so they go hand in hand. David?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the main thing with monitoring is just making sure you're being smart about where you invest in your monitoring to make sure you're answering a question that you want to answer. I think there's a lot of dollars spent on monitoring because it's in the permits and you want to make sure that you comply with that. But if you don't know what you're going to do with the monitoring data, then it's not gonna help you. And so there's been a lot of movement toward, can you collaborate, obviously with the sign off from your regulators or whatever, but can you work with other entities to answer key questions about how your BMPs are performing and making sure that you're tying it to your maintenance? I think there are increasingly creative approaches. I think Maryland has done a lot of that through some work at the Chesapeake Bay Trust and things like that. So there's some interesting approaches to trying to be more effective with the monitoring dollars that we're spending and making sure that it's working together with maintenance and other things that we're doing.
Thank you. I think it's great to know that others in neighboring states have done some of that similar work that we could learn from as well. So maybe following up on those contacts. Somebody had asked if there are reliable shapefiles for GSI inventory in Virginia. If you all know the answer to that, if not,
I would not be the expert on that.
Yeah, I would have to think about it also. I don't know that it's like a statewide type of shapefile. A lot of the BMPs that are like rolled up to the higher like that scale are kind of like we know what county they're in, but not necessarily where specifically they are. A lot of those maps are going to be very local, like asset inventory databases and stuff.
Many states run GIS data warehouses and they have incredible data in them. I know New Jersey, for example, runs LiDAR for the state. They have inventory of land use, land cover, streams, wetlands, soil types, changes in land use. There is much information available in some locations.
There was also a question, and others, we have a great community here online. I'm noticing by the names and organizations. So if others have more information on that answer, please feel free to share it in the chat. Another question was, how can stakeholders directly involved deal with invasive vegetation within stormwater sites in a manner that's still green and avoids the use of harmful chemicals? And I believe, David, you addressed that question with a guide that you put in the chat. And section 17 addressing invasives. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that or people could just dive into that particular section.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just quickly mention the Chesapeake Bay Landscaping Professionals, Chesapeake Landscaping Council. They have really great resources. They're my go-to when it comes to vegetation related questions. And so this guide that they have is, specific to landscaping, and it addresses all kinds of different things. But in section 17, they specifically have a section kind of on control methods for invasive plants, whether it's prevention, monitoring, manual, mechanical, biological control options, different things that you can do. Obviously, all of it requires a level of training or familiarity with plant identification and things like that to be involved in it. And that's why I lean on them because that's their specialty. But I just wanted to let folks know that that resource is out there.
Because stormwater basins and other facilities that accumulate stormwater basically receive runoff from surrounding land uses, they tend to carry a lot of seed for invasive species. And sometimes forebays and other trapping devices are very useful. I see another question about permeable pavements in the comments. And the experience with permeable pavements has been two in my history. One is that vacuuming is critically important, and while people think that sounds crazy, it's really essential to assure the performance both on sidewalks and in road settings and parking lots. Also, we find increasing use of porous concretes in slabs that can be removed actually and replaced. So there are several options available for permeable pavements.
Yeah, and Bill, here at Chesapeake Bay Foundation Brock Environmental Center, we have permeable pavers, and there was a large concern by the city officials that were allowing it at the time to do that, and maintenance has been actually somewhat agreeable. It hasn't been the oh no, this is going to be horrible. So again, plan for maintenance, but at some points, in some situations, it's not as onerous as some might fear. So again, plan ahead, but
I've
always good
always
to hear the
called
easy solution.
stormwater systems sort of the orphan utility. It's out of sight, out of mind. People haven't been charged for it oftentimes directly on their like water and sewer. But those systems require the same maintenance as water and sewer systems, and we shouldn't expect any differently.
Great.
I'll also just make a pitch for permeable pavement from an education and, community engagement perspective, even if they're not at large scale, like say it's a green alleyway or something like that. It's not necessarily all the value comes from just the treatment that you're getting, but I think it's a practice that people recognize and kind of intuitively understand kind of what its function is to soak in water. And I have heard from plenty of localities that have done them and said, like, this has been actually very effective for us in terms of engaging the surrounding neighborhoods, kind of on a broader stormwater discussion, because they do see it and kind of understand what it's for. And so they're getting some value that's maybe harder to quantify, but that is maybe worth, kind of that extra boost in certain locations.
And in those situations, it's really important to think about adding signage so people will understand what they're seeing and the benefits.
I think that's a great point, and I talk to the public a lot about infiltration, and some people want to go to sleep when I talk about such practices, but when you can point to a permeable paver and they can see how water's flowing, it's much more tactile. So I definitely appreciate the point, but the signage I think is key too. Well, with that, I'm going to pause. Bill and David were kind enough to share their slides. We can send those out, plus this recording and their contact information, which is really great. You have two wonderful experts here and really great attendance. Thank you all so much, Bill and David, for sharing time. We know you're busy and just really appreciate your expertise. I'm going to close. Carol Considine, would you want to share anything before I close this out?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I love those presentations. I thought they were great. And Bill, nothing, I hadn't really thought about it, but I think the integration of different departments in doing the maintenance of the green infrastructure is really important. And I'm not sure that the cities are thinking that way. So that was my aha moment. And so I really appreciate that. And David, all of that data, your presentation was wonderful. So excited to have all you here. I did put the Dutch Dialogues link in the chat. Please come and hear how the cities are incorporating green infrastructure on large scales here. And so we need to continue to support those efforts and encourage more green infrastructure in the cities. Thank you so much, everyone. Great webinar.
Thank you for hosting.
Yeah,
I
thank you all.
agree. Our next webinar is November 13th. We'll get information out to all the participants today about building flood resilience with green infrastructure. Excellent speakers lined up for that, so we'll get you more details. We also, for those in the Virginia Beach area, are interested to travel here at Brock Environmental Center on November 12th. We'll have Jeremy Hoffman speaking that evening, 6:30 p.m. from Groundwork USA, about some of those thermal heat impacts and the climate impacts and how we can find some solutions to that. So happy to share more information about that. That's going to be a great program. But again, thank you all for your time. Thank you to our excellent speakers. Really wonderful. Really appreciate the information and look forward to continuing this dialogue.
Good day, all.
Hi, everyone.